Week 13 was our little miniature week worth of stuff because it was test week. Quick and easy. So the first one, and our whole category here is other professional services. So here we're reporting on internal control in what they call an integrated audit. So an auditor in this case is engaged to do a couple of things. They're engaged to audit internal control along with the overall audit. So they're issuing a report that covers each, or separate reports on each. So this whole section, though, I mean, we've talked all year about what an audit is. So this section kind of takes us down the path of what do we do as far as this report over internal control. So we want reasonable assurance, and this is an important concept here. Under this little engagement, we want reasonable assurance whether material weaknesses exist. That is what we're doing. Anything less severe than a material weakness is not what we're looking at. And we're going to express an opinion on the effectiveness of internal control. If there are material weaknesses, then internal control cannot be considered effective. Pretty simple, right? So that's a very key takeaway from this. Material weaknesses, anything less severe, we're not looking for it. If there are material weaknesses, we cannot consider internal control to be effective. Significant deficiencies, if you remember, are less severe than material weaknesses. So that's not part of this engagement. So as always, management's in charge and has the responsibility for these things. We are just expressing an opinion about it. So in this case, management's got to provide us with their assessment of internal control. It has to be against some suitable criteria, such as COSO's framework, which I don't think we've ever talked about in this class. We talked about it in the BEC class. You don't really have to know what it is. It's just an internal control framework. So they're going to assess it, and we're going to have an opinion about it, right? So they're going to have to give us that assessment. They're going to have to provide us with a written assessment about effectiveness of internal control. We've got to plan and perform an audit to achieve the objectives of the audit engagement itself and the audit over internal control. And we're integrated, meaning we're doing it all at the same time. Why wouldn't we, right? They're all kind of interrelated anyway. The text mentions we should organize this as a top-down approach where we begin at the financial statement level and then start narrowing our focus down to the entity level controls, and then account balances, disclosures, whatever. Our report states, same as all of our reports, management's responsible for these things. They're responsible for internal control. They're responsible for their assessment about the effectiveness of internal control. We will refer to that report and we will express an opinion. And like we've said with a couple other sections, we can do separate reports or combined report. If separate reports, we would stick an other matter paragraph that refers to the other report. And we mentioned before that we're looking about whether there are material weaknesses. If there are, we say they're not effective, which means adverse opinion on internal control, right? So there you go. Pretty simple little section. I felt like these questions, there were a bunch, I think. 11. Just kind of real straightforward, honestly. repeating the things we've kind of already said. Which of the following conditions is necessary for us to accept an engagement to audit and report on internal control? Management has to present its written assessment about the effectiveness of internal control. That's a requirement of the engagement, right? We got to have that to do what we're doing. Real obvious except for here. You can easily pick this out as something that doesn't have to happen, right? It's real straightforward stuff. Just simple, real simple questions like, if we identify one or more material weaknesses, adverse opinion, right? Earliest date of the report, we've covered that, right? Yeah, these are just so super straightforward. I didn't highlight in my notes any of them to specifically look at. And then on a second read through, I'm not really seeing any I care to specifically spend much time on. Just did. So, maybe number one, an audit of internal control over financial reporting will generally, the answer is it'll be more extensive in scope than the assessment of control risk made during the financial statement audit. But again, I think that's really obvious, right? In just an audit, when we're not doing this, we do assess control risk. Well, now we're just doing an audit on internal control. Obviously, it's more extensive in scope. This is just straightforward stuff. So I don't see any worth messing with. And then this next section is one of those PCAOB on the same thing, and it's pretty much the same guidance. The guidance is kind of the same for both. So nothing new to really talk about. So those are always handy. I have questions, but same old things. There's that top-down approach thing. There's that about the paragraph related, stating or referencing the other report if they do separate reports. Yeah, it's all same old mess. So, okay, what else do we have? Okay, this little section is just a very specific type of engagement. Reporting whether a previously reported material weakness continues to exist. Very specific engagement here, right? So, you did some kind of procedure before, material weakness was there. Now they've hopefully fixed it, and we get to do a little bit of work and test and report that it does or doesn't exist still, right? So we're reporting on whether a previously reported material weakness continues to exist as of some date, and management's going to pick that date, right? This is not required. This is just a voluntary thing. It's like, yeah, we had that material weakness that hit the report. Let's get a report out that says that it's no longer a problem. You can see why somebody would want to do that, right? And this is all public company stuff. The date's going to have to be one that's after management's most recent annual assessment. Auditor's objective, kind of easy and obvious. We're going to express an opinion about the existence of that material weakness that was reported before. We're not reporting about overall internal control at this point. You can report on more than one material weakness as part of the same engagement. Why couldn't you? right? And then just kind of the same old thing again. Management has responsibility for internal control. They have to evaluate it, and they have to assert that these controls that are in place are now effective in achieving objective. They have to support that assertion with evidence or documentation. And if they don't do that, then there's no engagement to do. So that's all required. So management's got to do all this stuff. And then they're going to present a written report that will accompany our report. And it's going to say things like material weakness no longer exists as of this date because these controls address it. Just telling the story, right? But I guess the key takeaway, a lot of this is obvious, and I think the key takeaway is they've got to do this. That's part of the way this engagement's organized. They fix the material weakness, so they're going to evaluate whether the control they've now put in place is effective. But more importantly, they've got to support it with evidence and documentation and present a report. That's all required. So that's what management has to do. We're the auditor, so we've got to evaluate if all this is true that they just reported about. So we're going to evaluate whether the material weakness does or does not exist. We'll use materiality level at a financial statement level rather than an individual account level. We'll obtain an understanding of internal control. We have to perform a walkthrough for all the major classes of transactions that are affected by this little deal that's going on. But if we're the auditor who reported on internal control for the most recent annual deal, we don't have to do a walkthrough as part of this engagement because we've kind of already done all this, right? But we'll evaluate and we'll obtain evidence, obvious things. So it's kind of a weird little engagement. Three questions. The questions, this is a super long one. I think the author wrote this, but the answer is about this being a voluntary thing. It's never required to do this engagement. Yeah, these aren't really great questions to spend any time with. This one talks about materiality levels and everything. Nothing major. Just a general familiarity with this is plenty. And even more so with this next section about employee benefit plans. Just a quick read will do. Because this is such a huge area, and the content of this text even says this is such a huge area, right? That it covers X amount of pages in this document, and we're just introducing it, and here's a little bit of stuff for you to look at. So it spends a little time talking about what benefit plans are, but really, I just kind of narrowed it down to, if I'm studying for this, this is kind of my takeaway. So ERISA requires an annual audit of the financial statements of employee benefit plans. Typically, if the plan has at least 100 participants at the start of the year, that kind of is the threshold. And the participants for this definition are if there's 100 or more people eligible to participate, whether they participate or not. So you kind of get into that threshold of, oh, got to do an audit. This thing's big, right? If it's a welfare plan, they also have to have at least 100 participants, or once they reach the 100 participants, then you're getting into that audit territory. Here, that's defined as just anybody who's able to, whether they elected to or not. And if the plan is funded, which is to say that the assets are held in some kind of trust or some kind of account that the is named by the plan. There's an exemption for these audit requirements if the benefits are provided by an insurance contract, and if those contracts are funded by premiums paid from the employer's general assets. Just a quick read over this is plenty. It's just kind of, it's a little too far out there, so I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time worrying about it. Department of Labor requires planned financial statements to be filed on Form 5500. These may be GAAP, cash, or modified cash basis, and auditors required to express an opinion on whether the financial statements and supplemental schedules comply with their requirements. So, again, not a whole lot to worry with here. In these audits, Department of Labor regulations permit the plan management to omit certain investment information from the audit when those are held and certified. That's kind of the underlying thing there, by a qualified institution like an insurance company, bank, or a trust company. So they'll certify this, and that kind of relieves some of your requirements there, right? That certification must be furnished by the institution holding the assets. They certify that the investments and related activity are complete and accurate. We're not permitted to do an audit without that certification. We got to read it. We got to agree it to the certified information and verify disclosures. How much would I worry about this section? Very little, if any. It's just, I just don't feel like you get much. Give it a quick read. But I looked at the questions here and I'm just like, yeah, some author wrote these because they were easy to write. Tell me if these look like CPA questions. Which legislation is most directly associated with pension and welfare plans? Under applicable pension laws, the age that an employee is eligible to enter a pension plan cannot be above 21. You know, these are not questions that you get, right? An employee benefit plan that provides health care benefits to participants is a welfare plan. Yeah, these are not questions that you would get. Maybe number 5 with the, large plan having, but even this is a little too nitpicky with the 100 versus 150. I don't feel like that's walking around CPA knowledge there. That's asking too much for us to distinguish between 100 participants or 150. Now, maybe the whole deal where it's the start of the plan year, I feel like that's more important. It's like, okay, 100 participants as you begin the plan year, not necessarily as you're going throughout the year. I think that's a more important point than the 100 versus the 150. I don't know that any of it's that important though. Maybe 7 is a good one because that gets at that whole deal we were talking about right here with these things can be omitted if they're held and certified by some institution, right? So this audit of an employee benefit plan requires the auditor to evaluate each of the following except for what? This is not a very well written question, so I don't know. This is not great. Yeah, I just wouldn't worry about this section. I really wouldn't. They just kind of threw it in there, I think. That's it. My goodness. We're done. How about that? Huh?
That was fast.
That was fast. I was ready.